Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. High-ranking EU officials, national ministers, and OSCE representatives convened in Bucha, Ukraine on Tuesday in a show of unity with the country, but also amid unresolved questions about justice and enforcement. As calls for a tribunal grow louder and parallel negotiations continue, the gap between political resolve and legal outcomes remains in focus. And joining us now to discuss the latest is Rostyslav Khotin, senior editor, RFE/RL's Ukrainian service. Good to have you with us.
Hello, Sasha.
So it's 4 years since this massacre took place. If we just look at some of those numbers as well, apparently 400 civilians, and that's what the Ukrainians have tallied up at this point, who were killed there by Russian forces. We still don't have that tribunal. We still don't have, let's say, justice in that sense. What's missing, and how do you see this moving forward?
Yeah, it's been just 4 years since the liberation of Bucha in Kiev region by Ukrainian armed forces back in 2022, during the so-called epic Battle of Kiev, in the initial stage of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and hundreds and hundreds of Ukrainian civilians were killed by occupying Russian forces during month of March in 2022. And since that, Ukraine said this instituted war crimes because innocent civilians have been killed. They had no arms, they were unarmed, they just were under Russian occupation, and Russian soldiers brutally killed those innocent civilians. Russia later said that it was staged by Ukrainians. Later, it's kind of a theatrical staging, but it's of course a nonsense. So Ukraine wants justice, Ukraine wants fairness, and now there is a work is ongoing about creating of the special criminal tribunal which will investigate war crimes committed by Russian forces. The very fact that foreign ministers and top EU diplomats came to Kiev and met in Bucha during so-called Bucha summit, it's an indication that Europe is serious about investigating Russian war crimes, about punishment, about compensation, because Ukraine really wants justice. And we'll see. There will be board of this special criminal tribunal. Some countries already volunteered to become members of the board of this special tribunal. As the German foreign minister said in Bucha yesterday, where Putin's Russia comes, it brings war crimes and barbarism. Indeed, Ukrainians witnessed so many war crimes committed against civilians, not just in Kiev region, but in Kharkiv region, in Izium, in other places like Borodyanka and other places of Ukraine where Russian occupying forces stayed or still staying. And also, it's important to underline that the very fact that foreign ministers of the European Union came to Kiev, to Bucha, and expressed support, unwavering support for Ukrainian independence and territorial integrity and sovereignty, it's extremely important, because still 20% of Ukrainian land occupied by Russia. Some lands occupied during this 4-year full-scale invasion, some since 2014, like Crimea or parts of Donbass region. So it was important to hear this message from the European friends and colleagues for Ukrainians that they support Ukrainian territorial integrity, which should be restored after the war is over.
Mm-hmm. Also, you mentioned the chief diplomat of the European Union, Kaja Kallas, who was there. Also something that she announced, I believe, on her visit there was the actual profits. I believe it was about 80 million euros from those frozen Russian assets, the profits of that will be transferred to Ukraine. I mean, it's not the major next level that's still being blocked by Hungary. But tell us about the, let's say, effectiveness of that. I mean, that's not just symbol, that's also something tangible. And tell us how that's going to help Ukraine.
Yeah, Russia has an enormous, quite significant amount of frozen assets in the West. but the profits or the percentage, the interest rate of these assets will be already transferred to Ukraine, about 80 million euros. We'll see where we will go, but for Ukraine it's important message. First of all, political message that EU supports Ukraine, and including by financial means wherever it's possible. Also important that Russian frozen assets could be used for Ukrainian needs, because so far the whole process has been blocked by Hungary and by hesitation by some countries which host these Russian assets, like Belgium, for instance. They are afraid of precedent, but nevertheless, some of these Russian foreign frozen assets will be transferred to Ukraine. It's also not just financial step, it's political step, it's political statement. That's what's important, that Russian assets indeed could be used for Ukrainian needs. And the European Union has been able to frozen these assets. They will not be unfrozen until the end of the war and until Russia pays reparation to Ukraine. It's also important message that Russia should pay reparations. That's why also there is a talk now about creating, and it was created already kind of in the preliminary stage, so-called compensation commission, where thousands of Ukrainians already filed cases to this claims to this compensation commission, which will review them. Mostly complaints are about what? About destroyed property, flats in apartment blocks, which were destroyed during Russian bombardments by missiles, guided bombs, or drones, or private housing, which was destroyed during Russian bombardment and Russian occupation. So there are already a lot of cases filed by ordinary Ukrainians who were victims of Russian invasion to this compensation commission, which will later review them and will try to repay compensation, including from Russian frozen assets, or if Russia indeed will pay reparations after the war.
Mm-hmm. And I want to ask you about that as well. I mean, on one end, pursuing justice, and as you mentioned, there are reparations, that Russia must be held accountable. Speaking of the conflict on a wider sense, tell us, apparently there will be talks being held today between the Ukrainians, the United States, looking at that kind of direction. What do you expect from those talks? Where is that direction going right now in terms of anything significant ceasefire-wise? What's your take on it?
There was a feeling recently, lately, especially amid operation against Iran, that Ukrainian war is kind of shifted out of the radar of the United States. But it's not the true. It's not the true, because there was a round of Ukrainian-American talks in Florida recently. And also today there will be online meeting conference between Ukrainian and American delegations, and President Zelensky personally will take part. He was invited deliberately by American side to take part in this conference. Ukrainian-American negotiating teams will be talking to each other, and President Zelensky was deliberately invited by Americans to give his perspective on the ceasefire. There was also a feeling that these talks are leading to nowhere, to kind of dead end, because the sticking point is Donbass. Russia is strongly, persistently insisting on Ukrainian full withdrawal from Donbass, which is an acceptable condition imposed on Ukraine. Ukraine will not accept this, and there must be some ways around it, around this sticking point. So President Zelensky believes that there might be kind of breakthrough if American side will put additional pressure on Russia to be realistic. Also, Zelensky is offering energy ceasefire to Russia through Americans, via American side. If Russia stops targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure, Ukraine will stop targeting Russian oil infrastructure, which was intensified lately, especially with Ukrainian strikes against oil exporting infrastructure and oil terminals on the Baltic coast of Russian Federation in Leningrad region. So Ukraine is ready for energy ceasefire, which will be conveyed, this message of readiness will be conveyed to Moscow by American negotiators. And also, Ukraine offered Easter ceasefire for Easter, but it has been already rejected by the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov. So we'll see whether the energy infrastructure will work, because these the damage done by Ukrainians to Russian oil infrastructure is quite significant. It's very painful to Russia, especially when Russia wanted to cash during Iranian war on high oil prices on the global oil markets. Russia wanted to make a lot of cash out of it. But Ukrainian strikes against Russian oil infrastructure destroyed more than 40% of exporting potential of Russian Federation. So it's also painful for Russia. So we'll see what will be Russian response to this Zelensky's offer of energy ceasefire.
Mm-hmm. And also, I want to ask about the conflict at the moment. I mean, we have so many things in parallel. One thing we've been talking about as well is, of course, that critical lifeline still that comes from the United States, those arms deliveries, especially if we're looking at Patriot batteries or missile ammunition, rather. Have there been, can you give us any indication at this point, have there been any delays in terms of any deliveries from the United States to Ukraine in terms of that vital support that they need with ammunition?
As things stand now, at this moment, there was no reduction in American military and military equipment supplies to Ukraine despite the war in Iran. There was fear, of course, and uneasiness among Ukrainians that supplies might be diverted fully to the Middle East and the Gulf to supply American troops there and also Gulf allies of the United States. But nevertheless, as things stand now, there was no reduction in American military supplies to Ukraine, which are not just supplied for free, but actually are bought with European money, with money from the European members of NATO within the framework of so-called Pearl program within NATO, prioritize Ukrainian military needs. There is no reduction in American supplies, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio told Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha during G7 summit of foreign ministers recently that Americans are have no intention to deprive Ukrainians of arms supplies of critically needed missiles for Patriot systems and other anti-aircraft systems, air defense systems. Now there is alarm, there is uneasiness, that's true, but we have to state clearly that so far there was no collateral damage, let's say, for Ukrainian supplies amid Iranian war.
All right. So with that, we'll conclude that. Look, always a pleasure speaking to you. Rostyslav Khotin there. Thank you so much for that update.
Thank you, Sasha.
And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but stay right here on TVP World for more. Goodbye.